She left at 4 in the morning with her son strapped to her chest and nothing but 2 bags, his therapy materials, and the documents she had spent 3 weeks collecting in secret. And the first thing she felt when the taxi pulled away from the Quan estate was not grief. It was relief. Pure, flooding, shameful relief. The kind that only comes to a person who has been drowning slowly and has finally broken the surface. She did not look back at the house. Edwin was asleep against her heartbeat. His small curled fist pressed her collarbone, his breath warm and even in the dark. She held the back of his head with one hand and watched Soul slide past the taxi window in all its pre-dawn silence. And she made herself a promise, quiet and absolute and unwitnessed, that no one would ever make her feel like a problem to be managed again. Not for anyone. Not for any amount of money or love or history. She had loved Lee Kwan with the particular, dangerous depth of a woman who does not love easily. And he had let his mother destroy everything. She did not know, in that taxi, that 7 years would pass before she saw him again. She did not know what those 7 years would cost him. She did not know that the son he had let slip away in his silence would grow into something so extraordinary that the world would one day struggle to find adequate language for it. She only knew the dark road ahead, her son's weight against her chest, and the decision already made, already irrevocable, already hers. This is where the story begins. Not at the end, and not at the obvious beginning either, but here, at 4 in the morning, with a woman who has just chosen herself and a child who has no idea how exceptional he is about to become. They had met 3 years before that morning at an international development conference in Seoul. The kind of gathering that fills glass convention centers with people who use words like systemic and framework and mean them, where the coffee is bad and the conversations are occasionally brilliant and the funding decisions made inside hallways shape lives none of the attendees will ever directly encounter. Sheila had been there representing a humanitarian nonprofit, one of the junior coordinators in a delegation of 12, quiet and watchful in the way of someone who has learned to observe before they speak. She was not tall. She was soft-bodied in the way that had always made her slightly self-conscious in formal spaces, always aware of how she filled a room, always pulling at the hem of her blazer, but she had a quality of stillness that drew the eye if you're paying the right kind of attention. Lee Kwan was giving the keynote address. She had known his name, the way everyone in that room knew his name. His tech empire stretched across 4 continents, and his philanthropic portfolio was the kind that generated editorial coverage and imitators in equal measure. She had expected the arrogance that usually came packaged with that particular resume. Instead, she had watched a man in slim-framed glasses with short blonde hair stand at the podium and speak with a precision and a genuine discomfort with his own wealth that she found entirely unexpected. He didn't perform humility. He seemed to find the performance unnecessary because the discomfort was real. She had not expected him to sit beside her at dinner. She had not expected him to ask, with the directness of someone who had run out of patience for small talk sometime around his 30th birthday, what she actually thought about the gaps in the conference's proposed strategy for rural health infrastructure across Southeast Asia. And she had not expected to tell him, precisely, critically, without softening the corners for the benefit of the billionaire sitting across the table, exactly what she thought. He had looked at her over his water glass with an expression she couldn't fully read. Then he had said, "No one has said that to me in about 4 years." And she had shrugged and said, "Then you've been talking to the wrong people." And he had laughed, loud and sudden and unguarded in a way that turned heads at the neighboring tables. And something shifted in the room between them that neither of them acknowledged and both of them felt. What followed was slow and then suddenly fast, the way rivers behave before they meet the sea. They exchanged numbers with the studied casualness of 2 people pretending the exchange was routine. He called the following evening, and they talked for 3 hours about things that had nothing to do with development strategy. He sent her articles she hadn't read, and she sent him back corrections and additions. And somewhere in the middle of a voice note she was recording late on a Tuesday night, she stopped and listened to her own voice and realized she was happy in a way she had not been in a long time. Lee flew her out to Busan on a weekend and walked with her along the coast and bought her fish cake from a street vendor and told her, with the slightly awkward candor of a man who has not said something like this in a while, that he thought about her constantly and it was disrupting his concentration, and could she please tell him what to do about it? She had laughed so hard she had to hold the railing above the water. Then she had looked at him, at the sea wind pushing his blonde hair sideways and his glasses slightly askew on his nose, and she had said, "I think about you too." And he had kissed her there on the Busan waterfront with the waves below them and the city behind them, and two strangers looking on with the benevolent curiosity of people who recognize the real thing when they stumble past it. She moved to Seoul permanently 8 months later. The penthouse was all glass and pale oak and intelligent lighting that adjusted itself to the hour, and it was beautiful in the way of places where a great deal of money has been spent to produce the appearance of effortlessness. Lee was attentive and generous and frequently hilarious in the version of him that existed in private, padding around the kitchen in old university socks, crying at nature documentaries, calling his assistant to apologize when he'd been short with her, leaving little notes in Sheila's coat pockets because he thought it was romantic and she thought it was ridiculous, and she kept every single one. Was so thoroughly different from the composed public figure that she sometimes felt she was the only person alive who knew who he actually was. The only shadow was Mrs. Kwan. Lee's mother was a small and precise woman who carried disapproval like a second skeleton, something structural and load-bearing. She had looked at Sheila from their very first meeting with the assessing eye of someone calculating a risk, taking in the full-bodied softness of her, the dark skin, the locks, the foreignness of her, and arriving at a verdict that she saw no reason to conceal. She called Sheila the girl, in Korean to her staff in Sheila's presence, apparently unconcerned by the possibility that Sheila might understand more of a language than she let on. She made comments about food, about hair, about the appropriate way to conduct oneself in the Kwan household, each one precise and delivered with a pleasantness that made them harder to argue with. Lee told Sheila his mother would come around. She smiled and said, of course, and privately knew that this was the exact thing a man says when he does not want to deal with something. She never came around. The pregnancy arrived like weather, unplanned, undeniable, transforming the atmosphere of the penthouse permanently. Lee had stood very still when she showed him the test, and then pulled her close with both arms and held her for a long time without speaking, and she had felt something vast and certain settle between them. What she had not anticipated was that within 48 hours, Mrs. Kwan would arrive without notice, seat herself at the dining table like a judge taking the bench, and present Sheila with a set of handwritten conditions regarding the child's upbringing, its name, its schooling, its cultural formation, and buried in the third paragraph with the neatness of a legal trap, the implication that the child's primary residence would naturally be the Kwan family estate rather than the apartment. Sheila shared with Lee. Sheila had read every word. She had folded the document. She had photographed it on her phone in the bathroom afterwards with the steady hands of a woman saving evidence. She had not signed. Lee had not made her. But the fault line running through their relationship split a centimeter wider, and the weight that settled across Sheila's shoulders from that afternoon onward never fully lifted. Edwin arrived in the spring on a morning so clear the Seoul skyline looked painted. He came into the world screaming with magnificent conviction, and the delivery nurse had laughed and said this one had opinions. He was luminous, a perfect blend of his parents, with skin the color of warm toffee and a cloud of soft dark curls already forming at the crown of his head, and Lee's precise nose and the full generous curve of Sheila's mouth. Lee had wept at the bedside, glasses fogged entirely, laughing at himself for crying, and Sheila had watched him hold his son for the first time with an expression of helpless, wordless love, and believed, truly, completely believed, that this was the thing that would finally make everything else irrelevant. The signs began quietly, the way most profound things do. Edwin did not wave goodbye at 6 months. He did not point. He stacked blocks with a methodical precision that seemed years ahead of his age, but would not turn his head when his name was called from across the room. He could spend 40 minutes in perfect, absorbed silence, rearranging objects by a logic that only he could see, but he would not make eye contact when Sheila sang to him, though she noted carefully, held close, that he would press his small hand flat against her arm as she sang, as though the music was something he chose to absorb through touch rather than sound. By 18 months, the pediatrician had introduced the word gently and carefully with the practiced compassion of someone who knew what it cost to hear. Autism. The diagnosis landed in the Kwan penthouse like a stone into still water, and the ripples it sent out told Sheila everything she needed to know about the people around her. Mrs. Kwan did not grieve. She raged, not loudly. She was not a loud woman, but with the cold and devastating efficiency of someone who has decided that a problem must be corrected and has already begun calculating the method. She said, across a dinner table with 3 members of the Kwan extended family present, that the condition was clearly inherited from Sheila's side. She hired a specialist without telling anyone and had the man brought to the penthouse to assess Edwin with the energy of someone evaluating damaged property. She referred to Edwin's future with a careful use of the conditional tense that implied it was up for revision. And she looked at Sheila in those weeks and months after the diagnosis with an expression that no longer bothered to conceal what it meant. You have given us a problem, and I am deciding what to do with you. Lee did not agree with his mother. He said so once, briefly, and the saying of it cost him the kind of social capital that the Kwan family took months to rebuild. Then he began working longer hours. He came home to a quieter version of himself, distracted and careful, present in the apartment, but absent in all the ways that mattered. When Sheila told him about Edwin's sessions, about the small, bright sparks of progress, about the way their therapist had noticed that Edwin's pattern recognition was running significantly ahead of expectation, Lee would nod. He would say that was good. He would not ask a follow-up question. He was retreating, and Sheila could see it happening, and the worst part was she understood why. It was easier. His mother made it easier to step back than to step forward, and Lee Kwan, for all his extraordinary qualities, had never fully learned how to choose hard things when easy ones were available. The final act came on an evening when Lee was in Tokyo for business. Mrs. Kwan arrived at the penthouse at 6 o'clock, walked into the living room where Sheila was reading to Edwin. He loved the sound of her voice, would press himself close and run a finger along the edge of each page as she read, a ritual as precise and necessary as breathing, and stood in the doorway until Sheila looked up. What she said, in the measured and entirely composed tone of a woman announcing a schedule change, was that arrangements had been made. Edwin would remain at the Kwan estate under the care of a specialist staff. Sheila would receive a financial settlement that Mrs. Kwan described as generous, which meant it was enough to make the offer look responsible without being enough to make it look like guilt. There was a return flight booked. The date was in 4 days. This was not, Mrs. Kwan clarified, a conversation. It was a courtesy. Sheila looked at her son. She looked at his soft curls and the arc of his concentration as he traced the page edge and the particular quality of stillness he carried that was not emptiness but depth, an ocean mistaken for a puddle by everyone who had not learned to look properly. And something in her chest that had been slowly tightening for 2 years released. Not in collapse, but in the terrible clarity of a decision that has finally been reached. She said nothing to Mrs. Kwan. She finished the page she was reading. She turned off the lamp. She put Edwin to bed, and then she packed. 3 days later, at 4 in the morning, she was in that taxi with Edwin breathing against her collarbone, and Sol was sliding past the window, and the promise she made to herself in the dark was the most important thing she had ever said, even though she said it to no one. She flew to London. From London, she called her sister Adiz in Atlanta and said only, "I need somewhere to land." Adiz, who had the practical grace of someone who has spent her life catching falling things, met them at the airport with a blanket, takeout, and no questions that couldn't wait. Atlanta absorbed them. Sheila had a talent for building structure from incomplete materials, and she exercised it with the focused intensity of a woman who no longer had the luxury of doubt. She found an apartment with a ground floor garden that Edwin loved from the first afternoon, drawn to the specific angle of light across the grass in a way she didn't question and didn't need to. She enrolled him in a specialist learning program on the recommendation of a parent she met at his therapy center. She registered herself for a master's degree in public health policy, taking lectures while Edwin napped and studying after his bedtime with a single lamp and a cup of tea and the quiet stubbornness of someone who has stopped asking for permission. The consultancy work came 2 years after the degree, and she rose quickly, her assessments sharp, her presentations delivered without the habit she'd once had of making herself smaller. She stopped pulling at the hem of her blazer. She wore her size without apology, dressing in colors that suited her, standing at the front of rooms, and speaking from a place of certainty she had earned cell by cell over years of choosing herself when no one else would. She was not the girl who had tugged at her blazer at that soul conference anymore. She was the woman that girl had been becoming all along. And Edwin. Edwin was another story entirely. He was four when the learning program director sat Sheila down with a folder full of assessment results and the carefully measured excitement of someone delivering extraordinary news in a responsible clinical context. His working memory percentile was 99th. His pattern recognition was described in language that a 20-year veteran of developmental education clearly did not deploy lightly, as something she had genuinely never encountered before. He had taught himself to read at 3, not picked up isolated words, but read fluently, silently, consuming picture books and then chapter books and then, by 4.5, an illustrated children's encyclopedia of physics that he had pulled from the bottom shelf of a bookstore and refused to leave without. When introduced to a children's coding application, he exhausted its complete content in 2 sessions and then began modifying its underlying logic with workarounds that the software's designers had not anticipated. Sheila had cried in the parking garage on the way home from that meeting. She had sat with her hands flat on her thighs and cried silently for a long time, the way she only permitted herself when Edwin was elsewhere and could not feel her distress. She was not crying from sadness. She was crying from the release of a fear she had carried for so long it had started to feel like a part of her body. The fear that the world would always look at her son and see only what he couldn't do. And the fear was changing shape, and the new shape didn't have a name yet, but it was something close to awe. By 6, Edwin was attending a gifted program at a research university's affiliated school that had no precedent for admitting a child his age. The mathematics faculty had been introduced to his work through his primary therapist, who had shown a colleague a series of drawings Edwin produced during sessions. Complex, self-generated geometric sequences that initially read as art and revealed themselves, under faculty examination, to be something else entirely. The colleague had gone very quiet upon seeing them and asked how old the child was twice, as though the first answer had not been satisfactory. Edwin did not have conventional friendships, but he had profound and loyal affinities to his 2 therapists, to the older Ghanaian neighbor, Mr. Osei, who let him spend Saturday afternoons sorting through a collection of vintage transistor radios and never once asked him to talk if he didn't want to, and to Sheila above everyone, in the particular way of a child whose love is not decorative but structural. He would not always look at her, but he would always find her in any room and position himself close. And some evenings he would simply take her hand and hold it with the quiet certainty of someone who has already said everything important. She had learned that this was his language and that his language was enough. More than enough. She had also learned, though she tried not to examine it too closely, that she did not think about Lee every day anymore. By the 4th year, it was weekly. By the 6th, it was occasional, triggered by the specific way afternoon light moved across glass, or the particular laugh track of a nature documentary Edwin occasionally tolerated on screen, or the ghost of a voice note she would sometimes almost hear while making tea in the early morning. She thought about him without hatred and without longing, and with a complicated, honest tenderness that she believed was the correct response to a person who had been real and loved and badly insufficient. She thought about him, and then she moved on because she was good at that now. She had made herself good at it. She did not know what the 7 years had done to him. The Quan name had continued its expansion through the world with the impersonal momentum of real institutional wealth, acquisitions, partnerships, charitable endowments that generated the right kind of coverage. Lee had remarried at 38. His mother had orchestrated it with the precision she brought to everything she considered a structural matter, selecting a woman from a family whose social coordinates were immaculate. The marriage had lasted 2 years. It had produced no children. The tests that followed were quiet and clinical and eventually conclusive. Lee was infertile. The condition had no clean origin and no remedy the specialists could offer. There would be no heir. The legacy Mrs. Quan had engineered with such ruthless care was a line that ended with a man standing in front of her, and she had enough self-awareness to know, in the privacy of her own unspeakable moments, that she had helped build the circumstances that led here. Lee did not speak about this publicly. What he did, in the long months after his divorce, was sit with himself in the way he had never been comfortable doing. He thought about Edwin with a frequency and a quality of pain that he had no outlet for. He thought about a small face in a photograph, provided through lawyers as part of the custody documentation, taken at Edwin's 3rd birthday. The boy looking sideways at a balloon with an expression of such focused, interior intelligence that Lee had kept the photograph in his desk drawer and looked at it more mornings than he would ever admit to anyone. He thought about Sheila standing in the Busan wind with fish cake in her hand, telling him the truth about things when no one else would. He thought about what it meant that the best person he had ever known had left his house at 4 in the morning with his son and not looked back. He had tried twice to make contact. Her lawyer's response both times was professional, measured, and absolute. He had not tried a 3rd time. He did not feel he had earned the right. Then November arrived with a fundraising gala in New York, a global health equity event, the kind Lee attended as a matter of professional obligation. And on the attendee list his assistant sent over for review, halfway down the 3rd page, was a name that stopped him cold. Sheila was there as a lead consultant on one of the consortium's flagship programs. She had almost not come. Edwin had a school presentation the following week, and she had been absorbed in helping him prepare, though Edwin's idea of preparation was to build a 3-dimensional physical model of the concept using materials from the kitchen and then explain it to Sheila in the calm, unhurried way of a child who has been certain about things his whole life. Adiz had eventually overridden Sheila's hesitation with the particular authority that older sisters hold over their younger ones, and Sheila had packed the burgundy dress, full and long and the exact color of wine held up to light, and flown to New York on a Thursday. She wore her locks pinned up with a gold clasp that Edwin had selected from her jewelry box that morning with characteristic finality. He had picked it up, turned it once in his fingers, and placed it in her palm without ceremony. She had kissed the top of his curls and told him she'd be back Sunday. He had returned to his model without looking up, which was his way of saying he knew. The ballroom was everything such ballrooms are, high-ceilinged in ivory and gold, with several hundred people performing the intricate social choreography of the philanthropically wealthy, a string quartet providing acoustic cover in the corner. Sheila had found her table, greeted colleagues, accepted champagne, and was in the midst of a conversation about cross-regional health data when she looked up. He was standing 20 feet away. The years had done something to him she had not predicted. He was still lean, still wore glasses, new frames, darker, tortoise shell, and his hair was shorter than she remembered, the blonde now threaded with early silver at the sides in a way that suited him in a manner he probably hadn't intended. He wore a charcoal suit and held a glass loosely and stood with the slight apartness that had always been his, present but sealed off, the solitude of someone permanently surrounded by people seeking something from him. He was nodding at whatever the man beside him was saying with a patient, polished expression she recognized from every event they had attended together, the face he wore in public like light armor. Then he turned, and he saw her. The armor went, just for a second, a single unguarded second, and what she saw on his face in that second was something so unmediated and exposed that she had to look away before she could process it. She turned back to her colleague and finished her sentence perfectly, and set her champagne glass down with a steadiness that she considered one of her finer performances of the last 7 years. He crossed the room during the interval between the welcome address and the first speaker. She felt his approach before she saw it, the specific gravity of him, unchanged. When he touched her elbow, it was with the tentativeness of someone who understands they are not owed the touch. Sheila, Lee. She turned, looked at him directly, gave him nothing free. He looked like a man who had been rehearsing a speech for years and had just understood that none of it would do. He opened his mouth, closed it. She waited with the stillness she had cultivated over 7 years of choosing patience over reaction. I need to talk to you, he said quietly. I know I don't have the right. I am asking anyway. 10 minutes. Somewhere quieter. She looked at him for a long moment. This man with his silver blonde hair and his fog-prone glasses and the years written into the lines of his face. And she made the calculation she had long ago decided she would make if this moment ever came. Not an emotional one, a considered one. 10 minutes, she said. They found a corridor off the main hall. all tall windows and the cold geometry of the Manhattan skyline below. Lee stood with his hands in his pockets and the look of a man who has arrived at a confession after a very long road. "I've been trying to reach you," he began. "I know," she said. "I chose not to respond. That was your right. Everything you did was your right. Leaving, not responding, I know that." He took his glasses off and pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose, a habit so familiar it did something quiet and involuntary to her chest. He replaced them. "I'm not here to excuse anything. I'm not here to ask you to forget it. I am here because," he paused, breathed, "Edwin. I'm here because of Edwin." The name between them was enormous. 7 years enormous. "I have no right to him," Lee said. "I understand that. I did not protect him when he was in my house. I did not protect you. And I have had 7 years to understand exactly what that means and exactly what it cost. And I can't undo it, but I am asking," his voice fractured. He held it together. "I am asking if there is any world in which you would allow me to try." Sheila was quiet for a long time. The city moved below them, indifferent and relentless. "He's exceptional," she said, "not as softness, as a reckoning. He's 7 years old, and the mathematics faculty at his university research school have called his work remarkable. He builds conceptual models with kitchen materials and explains them with the patience of a professor. He communicates on his own terms, and those terms are more sophisticated than most adults I know." She held Lee's gaze. "Your mother told you he was a problem, that he was evidence of something wrong, and you said nothing." She let that sit. "He is the least problematic person I have ever known. He is a miracle, and if you come into his life and treat him as anything other than the extraordinary person he is, I will remove you without hesitation and without apology." "Understand," Lee said. "Do you?" "Yes." And there was nothing conditional in the way he said it. She turned to the window. She let herself think, something she normally kept tightly controlled in any space that contained him, about the night in Sock Show 2 years before the pregnancy. They had gone to the coast for a long weekend with a group of Lee's colleagues, a sprawling rented house above the water. She had slipped away from a noise to take a call on the lower deck, and in the dark had not seen that the wooden planking at the edge was rotted through, had stepped forward and gone through it clean, dropping into the water below with a shock of cold that folded every breath out of her body. The sea had been black and deeper than she'd expected, and the cold confusion of it had pulled her under before she could organize herself to swim. She had gone under, and she had felt, in those few seconds, the particular terror of understanding that something irreversible was happening. And then a hand had closed around her wrist, decisive, total, no ambiguity in it, and she had been pulled upward and broken to surface coughing and gasping and been hauled over the edge of the dock by multiple hands. She had lain there on the wet planks for a full minute unable to speak. When she'd finally looked up, Lee was there, soaked to the collar, glasses gone, his face white in the dock light, his hands shaking as he pressed into her face and said her name with the terrified repetition of someone who has nearly lost something they cannot name the value of. He had not deliberated. He had seen her go under, and he had jumped. She had never, in all her years of legitimate anger, stopped knowing that this was true about him. It did not balance anything. It was not a trade. It was simply a fact, a real, irreducible fact about who Lee Kwan was at the level beneath the failures, beneath the silence, beneath the man his mother had conditioned him to choose convenience over courage. There was a man in him who, when given no time to think, jumped. "I'm not telling you that everything is forgiven," she said to the window, then turned to face him. "It isn't. What happened to me, and Edwin in that house lives in my body still. I expect it always will." She paused. "But I'm not a person who believes that what someone does in their worst moments is the total of what they are. I know what it takes to change. I've done it." She looked at him steadily. "Edwin deserves to know his father if his father is prepared to show up. Consistently. On terms that work for Edwin and his therapist, not your schedule. With full respect for the life I have built for us, without interference, without your mother anywhere near my son." "Agreed," Lee said. "Immediately. Without qualification. There's one more thing." Sheila crossed her arms, and something in her face shifted, not softened, but opened. "He's been asking about his father for about a year. Not with distress. Edwin doesn't do distress the way other children do. He asks the way he approaches everything, systematically, because he wants to understand the variable. She paused. He drew a picture once of what he imagined his father might look like. The man in the drawing had glasses. Something in Lee's face broke very quietly. He looked at the ceiling. His jaw moved. When he looked back at her, his eyes were wet behind the tortoiseshell frames, and he was making no effort to hide it. I would like to meet him, he said. Whenever you decide. Whenever he's ready. I will wait as long as you need. I'll think about it, Sheila said. But she heard it in her own voice, the same thing he heard. The door not slammed. The beginning, not the end. She had built enough of her life to know the difference between closing and opening, and she was not closing this. They stood in the corridor as the gala moved behind the walls, muffled and irrelevant. Sheila looked at Lee Kwan, at the man he had been, and the man he had failed to be, and the man the years had made of him. And she felt all of it at once. The grief and the warmth and the anger and the complicated, durable thing that survived all three. She did not pretend it was simple. She did not need it to be. I'll have my lawyer call your office Monday, she said. A framework. Boundaries. You take what's offered and build from there. Yes, Lee said. Whatever you need. She looked at him for one more moment. Then she picked up her champagne from the side table and walked back toward the ballroom. At the entrance, she paused and turned. He prefers to be approached sideways, she said quietly. Don't stand in front of him and wait for eye contact. Sit near him and work on something. He'll come to you. Lee stood very still, committing this to everything he had. Sheila walked back into the ballroom and rejoined her table and finished her champagne and talked with her colleagues about things that mattered. And the evening continued the way evenings do, moving through its acts towards close, indifferent to the extraordinary thing that had just been agreed in a corridor off its edge. And in Atlanta, in a ground-floor apartment where the garden caught the last of the evening light through the kitchen window, a 7-year-old boy with warm toffee skin and dark soft curls sat long past his bedtime with a lamp on and a page in front of him, working through a problem no one had assigned him. He filled the margins when the page ran out, his numbers and patterns spilling beyond the white borders because what he had to say was always larger than the space the world had prepared for it. Precise and luminous and entirely his own. A whole universe, thinking quietly in the dark.
And that is the end of the story, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. The moral lesson for today's story is that sometimes the people the world misunderstands the most are the ones carrying the greatest brilliance. Real love is not controlling, fixing, or abandoning someone when life becomes difficult. Real love is choosing to protect, understand, and stand beside them anyway. And that is the moral lesson for today's story. Thank you all for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share.